Roll.
Steve McLucky,
Present.
Sherry Tindall,
Here.
Les Boatright,
Here.
Michael Talcott,
Here.
Anthony Jeremita.
Here. Okay, first off, we need to approve the minutes from the last meeting. So would anybody like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, please call the roll.
Steve McLucky,
Yes.
Sherry Tindall,
Yes.
Les Boatright,
Yes.
Michael Talcott,
Yes.
Anthony Jeremita.
Yes. Okay, next on the agenda, it's time for us to elect our officers for the next year. So we will do the chairperson first, and then vice chair. So does anybody have any nominations to make?
I'd like to nominate or renominate Anthony Jeremita for chairman.
Okay, that's one. Does anybody else have any nominations?
I'll nominate Les Boatright.
Okay. Anybody else? Hearing none. We'll vote. We vote. Okay. So, those voting for Anthony, raise their hands or call the roll? Okay.
Steve McLucky,
So
You're voting for Anthony.
this is voting for Anthony, so what's the response for voting for or against? Is that what you say? Okay, I've never done it like this before. Against.
Okay.
okay, we'll start over.
Okay.
Steve McLucky,
Against.
Sherry Tindall,
Against.
Les Boatright,
Against.
Michael Talcott,
For.
Anthony Jeremita.
4. Okay. Now for Mr. Boatright,
Steve McLucky,
For.
Sherry Tindall,
4.
Les Boatright,
4.
Michael Talcott,
Against.
Anthony Jeremita.
vote 4. Okay, so now we'll do vice chair. Does anybody have any nominations to make?
I nominate Sherry Tindall.
And I would like to nominate Mike, Mr. Talcott. Okay, so the first vote will be for Ms. Tyndall.
Any other?
Are there any others?
There's not many of us left.
Honorary vice chair for every member.
Okay, hearing none, this first vote will be for Ms. Tyndall.
Steve McLucky,
For.
Sherry Tindall,
4.
Les Boatright,
4.
Michael Talcott,
Against.
Anthony Jeremita.
4. The next one will be for Mr. Talcott, or do we need to? Okay. All righty. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Boatright.
Okay.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, I want to say for the last year, thank you guys for your service and your comments that you provided us along the way. We know we've got a lot of work ahead of us, so appreciate your involvement. All right, so now we're down to the next item here is discussion. And the first one is on public power. John Twitty, President, CEO of Missouri Public Utility Alliance. And I'll turn it over to Director Nail to start.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
a question. We're still on action items and I was going to bring up an item.
I think we'll bring that up during your comments.
Okay,
Is it something
so
we can get to?
voting
Yeah.
voting is allowed during the comment
Yeah, you
section.
Make a motion.
Perfect. Sorry for the interruption.
Well, several months ago, it was expressed that there was a desire of the board to have somebody from the industry, and the suggestion was American Public Power Association. We recommended that because we had such an expert right here in the state of Missouri, that possibly have MPUA President John Twitty to come and address you and answer whatever questions you had. He graciously accepted, and so I will turn it over to John. He's the president of Missouri Public Utility Association, and here to give you a brief intro and then answer whatever questions that you might have.
Jim, thank you very much. Members of the Public Utility Advisory Board, let me start out by saying thank you for your service. I've been in the business 40 years, and I've worked with lots of folks who serve as volunteers, whether it's on an advisory board or a board of public works or a board of public utilities. So I have a little sense about what it is that you all are engaged in. I'm certainly aware of the questions before you all and the city council and Independence, and perhaps ultimately the citizens of Independence about the future of Independence Power and Light. All of my 40 years of service have been in the municipal utility sector, and I worked at both Rolla Municipal Utilities in Rolla, Missouri, and City Utilities in Springfield. And so I think maybe over those 40 years, I have a little perspective about what is good for customers, and the customers, of course, in municipal utilities are also the citizens. That's one of the beauties of the public power model. And I would just say, and then I'm certainly happy to respond to questions that you have or offer at least my perspective. It's a pretty interesting time to be in the utility business generally, whether that's a municipal utility or rural electric cooperative or an investor-owned utility. And I was telling Jim and Joe both earlier, it seems to me that the next 10 or 15 or 20 years are going to be increasingly interesting because there are so many questions related to how we make electricity. Really, we haven't changed much about the distribution or transmission of electricity so much as how we make it. And obviously most of that, I think, is driven by a concern about the environmental attributes of whether we burn coal or split atoms or harness falling water or harness the wind or the sun. And they're really difficult questions, and they have impacts on the reliability of service. They obviously have impacts on the affordability of service and clearly on the environmental attributes of service. And it requires on your part and members of the city council in Independence to try to look down the road a bit and think about what is best for the citizens. At the end of the day, and you won't, it's kind of common in our business to call customers ratepayers. You won't ever hear me call customers ratepayers because to me, a ratepayer is simply somebody that has no choice in the matter. Clearly, customers have choices about things. You can go to Target or you can go to Walmart. You can buy a Ford or a Chevy. In the case of an electric utility customer, I get why customers are called ratepayers because by and large, you really don't have any choice about who your distribution provider is unless you want to move somewhere. But you do have choice about how and when you use service. And in some cases, you have a choice about making a vote one way or the other. I will just be real upfront with you and say I am an absolute proponent of municipal utilities. Again, all of my career has been spent in that sector. I think locally owned municipal utilities provide a local control. It's really not any different than you hear people talk about school districts. It's local control. And if you want to teach X and somebody wants to teach Y, it's up to the locality to determine. In the case of Independence Power and Light, if you want Independence to really be on the leading edge of renewable energy, you have the ability to make that happen. If, on the other hand, you are more concerned about the cost associated with electricity, you have the way to make that happen. And if ultimately there is a question put before the citizens about whether to sell or not, I think there's an awful lot of evidence, and I think these studies that are about to get underway are going to prove that point. So I say that only to suggest that if you ask me a question and it's about local control versus not, you ought to know that right up front. Now I'll try to be as objective as I can, and again, my years of service perhaps give me some viewpoints that would be helpful in that regard. But I do want you to know that up front. It's a great business to be in. These guys have great opportunities. These folks that help them do what they do have a great opportunity to serve a very high calling, in my judgment. And I know both of these gentlemen quite well and appreciate their dedication to the citizens who happen to be the customers of Independence Power and Light. I've spoken with them enough to know that, and you are to be complimented that they are here literally keeping the lights on every day. So with that little bit of an introduction and a little bit of an introduction of my bias, if I can't hide it, I'd sure be glad to respond to questions that you might have about the future that is unfolding before you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Twitty. Any questions or comments from the group? Okay.
Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
Thanks. Thanks for being here today.
You bet.
This gives us a real good opportunity to kind of share with the citizens too. So I think my first question would be, can you give us, I know you kind of did a little bit in your overview, but can you give us a little more on benefits of a municipality versus for-profit?
Well, I think I can. It's not uncommon, of course, for any utility operating in a city to pay some sort of a dividend. In the case of municipal utilities, it's typically called a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes, because Independence Power and Light, being a municipal operation, doesn't pay tax in the same way that Evergy would, of course, and doesn't pay federal or state income taxes. So it's called a payment in lieu of taxes, and it's not uncommon for that number to be really all over the board. I'm aware that in the case of Independence, it's a little bit north of 9% of gross revenues. I'm familiar most with Rolla and with Springfield. In Springfield, ours was about, in total, the total transfer was about 7.8%, but only 3 and 4% of that, depending upon whether it was electricity or natural gas or water, were the actual pilots. But it's also typical for there to be other kinds of things, most likely of monetary value, but it could be in-kind services that the municipal utility provides. And I know that in the case of Independence Power and Light, there is this little bit over 9% payment in lieu of tax, cash to the city general fund. But there are other shared services, perhaps, that Independence Power and Light provides that help the city provide those services to the park system and the police department, the fire department, and all the other operating arms of government. And I'm aware that, for instance, not uncommon for street lighting to be a central question. And in the case of the utilities I'm familiar with, and probably most of our members, we have about 100 members, about 100 municipal utilities across the state. Not uncommon for those street lights to be maintained by, and maybe even the energy to power those street lights to be provided at no cost. Sometimes we call them free services. Well, they aren't free. It's just a question about who actually pays for it. So I know that's a component of Independence Power and Light. Other departments, perhaps the finance department, exist to provide services across the city footprint. And let's just jump ahead and say, what if Independence Power and Light was not in existence any longer? Let's say the citizens had voted to sell it. what kind of an impact does that have on the finance department? Does the finance department get smaller because you don't have Independence Power and Light needs to handle? I don't know the answer to that. My guess is probably not. And so there is a cost associated with that remaining finance department that is not now being covered by those funds. So I think what I would hope the studies that you're going to do will be very complete in what that value is. And I'll just end it by saying we have another community, one of our members in the last couple of years, that went through this question about why don't we just sell out to the local rural electric cooperative? They will pay us a 5% payment in lieu of taxes, just like the electric department is paying now. And in terms of that 5%, those 5% are, of course, virtually the same dollars. And I said to the director in that particular town when all of this conversation was getting started, okay, but what else do you do? Do you maintain the streetlights? Do you provide the energy? And he said, well, let me give you 4 or 5, just right off the top of my head, examples. And one of them was we had to move a power line in order for the road circumstance in that particular spot to be changed. He said it cost about $500,000. City general fund pay you for that? No. I said, are you recording that somewhere on a spreadsheet, on a legal pad in your office? Well, probably not as well as I should be. And I think these gentlemen would tell you they've got a pretty good idea about those other services. Again, they may be called free services. They are not free. There are real dollars being spent to do them. So I would hope that the study would suggest what all of those numbers are, so that if there is an ultimate vote in the city of Independence, the citizens who are voting have a complete picture. All of that to say, I suspect if people think we provide 9.08% of a payment in lieu of taxes, that actual number is bigger, maybe by half, maybe by the same amount. So it might be 15 or 18% that you're getting paid. If you sell out, whoever the owner and future operator would be aren't going to provide those same free services. You will get a bill for those, if they will even do some of them. I hope that's somewhat
Yeah.
responsive.
That does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
You mentioned Springfield, and I get a lot of emails from citizens comparing Independence Power and Light with Springfield. Since you have knowledge of Springfield, is that a fair comparison? I mean, is that kind of apples to apples? Or?
Yeah, I will say it's a partial fair comparison. Talk about equivocating. It's a partial fair comparison. In Springfield, the electric system, the gas system, and the water system are in fact like this.
Okay.
I realize that in Independence, the electric system and the water system and the sewer system are in this building, but are you getting full advantage of the economies that come with real integration? And I might suggest, and I don't have any great inside knowledge about that, but I would suggest there probably would, I don't want to step on anybody's toes who's in the water and the wastewater business in
He's retiring, he doesn't.
in Independence. But I suspect there probably are a few more economies that could be measured and an actual benefit received from. In terms of the operation of the electric system versus Power and Light, there's a lot of similarities. Springfield's a little bigger. Springfield probably has a little bit more internal generation. But you know, it's probably true enough that as the business has changed over the last 10 or 15 years, this question of internal generation it cuts both ways. I tell people in Springfield, I still live some of the time in Springfield and some of the time in Columbia. But if I'm in Springfield and that's my home, I'll still have people ask me because they know I used to work at City Utilities, and there's one large power plant there and then 2 other smaller now. And I will, if it comes up in conversation, I'll say, you know, the people who make the decision about whether that big power plant runs or not are not in Springfield. they're in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then you get into a whole conversation about, how in the world does that happen? Now, it's also true that controlling your own generation, even if start and stop decisions are made someplace else, I still think there's advantage to having it where you can see it and look at it, touch it. It's your employees operating it, and I'm aware of the conversation that you all have had and the council have had about replacing some of the internal generation here with, and I'll just say, more modern, more efficient equipment. And I know that's not an active consideration at this point, but there's certainly those kind of similarities. And again, the biggest similarity is they are systems of some size. Lots of our 100 members are quite small. We have a member that has 250 citizens, and we have Springfield and Independence and Columbia. And so I think a lot of the similarities about how we operate are certainly there. In Springfield, there's a Board of Public Utilities, and it has significant responsibility for the management of the utility. You all have an important role to play in Independence, but the ultimate fiduciary responsibility lies with the members of the city council. I'll go out on a limb here. You can see whether these guys are kicking me or not, but I'll go out on a limb here and say Independence would be well served to have a statutory Board of Public Utilities, or call it whatever you wish for it to be called. It helps provide an insulation from the political consideration that city councils necessarily have. I mean, we can say there's something bad about it, but you'd be saying we're going to try to turn everything on its ear. City council members are elected, and that creates a circumstance that you get a little insulation from if you have a statutory Board of Public Utilities. Probably even if you decided to do that in Independence, and I don't know that that's an active consideration now, but I guess it doesn't mean that you all couldn't recommend it somewhere along the trail. Probably City Council, at a very minimum, remains the responsible party for naming the members of the board, and they might even remain the ultimate authority for approval of a budget, for instance, and approval of rate changes, for instance. But if you give the members of City Council that buffer, that a Board of Public Utilities makes recommendations, I think there's some benefit to that. I would also mention that the other utility I was employed by, Rolla Municipal Utilities, also has a board. So I'm a bit of a fan of that kind of governance structure. So that would be a fundamental difference in the two.
The only other question I have is, when you were talking about the report that is apparently being done, could you give us some idea, what should we look for in this report to kind of sway our opinion one way or the other? I mean, can you give us some advice on what to look for?
Well, I think so. Let me start out with, you should make sure that it absolutely is an apples and apples comparison. And I said earlier, you need to make sure that you understand all of the forms of support that Independence Power and Light provides to the citizens and to the city of Independence. And if it doesn't, you need to make sure that it does. I think you need to use that opportunity to fully, and I guess I'm saying really the same thing, fully understand the advantages of local control and local ownership. I think you should try to the fullest extent possible for that analysis to be made free of the political ramifications. Whether you like it or not, we live in a time in our nation's history where there's lots of people who have lots of opinions, and they get expressed on Facebook and Twitter pretty regularly. And the concern I have about that is an awful lot of the time it's not based on the real world. What are actually the facts? And so I think you need to try to be as objective as you possibly can. I have said to my colleagues, I've probably said to these two gentlemen who are members of our organization, and we're partners in power supply projects today, not that they're going through us. We are a power supply organization, among other things, but we are partners in certain power projects around the general region. But I really am trying to be objective here. I think you need to understand that you have a lot of expertise sitting right here in Independence, Missouri. These two guys are but two examples. I know others on the staff at Independence Power and Light. I find them to be among the best operators of utilities that I know of, and I've had the opportunity to be engaged in national public power arenas. I was chair of the American Public Power Association a number of years ago, so I know some folks around the country. These folks are top notch. Not to say that if the citizens ultimately voted to sell, that you wouldn't get top flight energy operators, electricity system operators from a third party that became your utility provider, but you won't get any better than these folks. And maybe that's somewhat helpful about what you ought to be looking for.
Thank you, appreciate it.
You bet.
That's all I got.
I do have one. I like the direction you were going with the political ramifications of the city council's decisions. And I think that's one reason why we haven't had a rate increase since 2012, which I personally consider negligent, because a gallon of milk was like $2. And we not only have not increased, but we threw the rates out the window a few years ago when we needed to start looking at updating equipment. And then that became not possible. So I think it's something to consider, restructuring whether our recommendations had more weight, and maybe technical expertise was added, and so forth. And I assume that's more required when there is a board that has more decision-making power, more technical expertise, financial expertise.
Certainly was true in Springfield. The city charter specifically called for people with business and professional experience to sit on the board.
We have
Anybody can be elected to a city council, of course, if they get the most votes.
right.
But that board, at least in Springfield, that charter said business and professional experience. Because you're running the biggest, you're running among the biggest, you're certainly running the biggest business in the city, without question.
I didn't know that.
Well, because the assets that make electricity are very expensive.
True.
You touch every life 24 hours every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the water and the wastewater utilities do too. But I bet you couldn't find another industry, maybe the phone business. But okay, my phone call doesn't go through right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a darn inconvenience. My lights are off. That's the big deal. You can't, you all know this, of course. Everybody knows this, whether they verbalize it or not. You can't live modern life without lights. You can't live life at all, of course, without water. And most of us would like the wastewater to go the right direction out of the house. I've interrupted you. My apologies.
No, that's okay. Yes, I agree that none of the rest of it would be worth having if we couldn't.
You can have the best bank, the best
Push that
hospital, the best
lever.
whatever. But if you don't have lights, you don't have any of those.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the board structure could be improved. And I think there, especially with looking at modernizing toward renewables, the structure of the board maybe wouldn't be all business people, but rather people who are business minded, but toward keeping the planet alive as well. So I think that really can set in motion a discussion between us and the council, maybe get together and chat about that. But I'm looking at this topic that we're going to go into where the ratepayers are going to start getting upset.
They're
because-
customers.
You're right. I'm following Jim's lead
Pardon
on
me.
that. Yes, I'm following
Okay, you
Jim's
can't
lead.
call them ratepayers anymore, guys.
And I like that though. I like customers. Yeah. So the customers will start to see their bills move just a little bit. Estimated $10 for a typical household. When that happens in other markets that you've seen, could you give us any tips on that?
Well, the most important thing that these guys do every day is keep the lights on. If you think about their responsibility, it is to keep the lights on. It is to provide service at as reasonable a cost as you can, and it is to pay attention to how the electricity is generated and its impact on the planet, as you said. So reliability, affordability, and responsibility is kind of the way most people in the electric utility business talk about it these days. You got to maintain the system. I'm aware that there were some outages associated with a storm just a few days ago, and one of the advantages in a metropolitan area like this is you have others that you can easily compare to in terms of responsiveness to restoration efforts, and so part of that is the